not get to those yesterday, then we'll jump right into delayed order events and auto DC rules. Okay, let me turn the record on.
The host has the recording feature on.
Okay, finally, right? Okay, so order checks are, it's a system or a set of rules that are written and deployed by the VA through the FOIA releases, and they manage the order checking between the orders, as far as duplicate orders, duplicate opioid orders, duplicate drug class, things like that. It also checks against allergies entered into the medical record, as well as adverse reaction allergies to food and drugs. And all of these order checks are presented to the user at the point of entry so that they can cancel the order or override the order, in some cases with actual text or an explanation as to why they're overriding it, and others they can just override just by clicking continue. The nice thing about order checks, other than the fact that it allows the physician to see those issues before they accept an order, is that it also records the data in the order details. So when they bypass or override an order check, it's displayed in the order details. So let me select the patient. And Diane, I believe you have seen some of these when we were doing super user training at Stillwell.
Yes.
Right? So you've seen how they present to the user. So we won't go back over that part. What we're going to jump right into is how you set up or enable order checks. Now, when you're in the CareView application, very similar to notification, the user has the ability to go in and see which order check rules are turned on. There is a setting for mandatory with order checks, just like notification. And most of the time, most clients will probably set the majority, almost any order check they turn on, they're going to set to mandatory. Now, it's listed as mandatory in the CareView application, but when you look at it in PuTTY, you're actually setting it to be, quote, uneditable by the user. So a little bit different terminology, but doing exactly the same thing. At this point, this client does not have very many at all set to mandatory. They just have 2. That will probably change. But as you can see, I can turn them on and off at this point just by checking or unchecking.
And a user could do that then, okay.
User could do that. These are also not retroactive, so we need to get these set up as uneditable as soon as possible so that the users haven't already turned them off, right? Okay, so let's go over to PuTTY and look at the menus that we can use to manipulate order checks. technical applications menu, so I'm going to use test and then go to the MSC CSA menu. We're going to use the care view configuration menu. And this time we want to go to order check, and that will be, let me find it. This menu is a little different from the CPRS one, so it takes me a second. Oh, it may be under order. Let's see if it's under order. It is. Okay, so we're gonna use ORD for order menu management, and under that is the order check configuration menu. So we're going to OCX, and from there we're able to compile rules, activate, inactivate rules, enable or disable the whole system. Remember that from notifications.
Yep.
So we have to make sure that it's turned on altogether, and then we also have some parameters that go along with order check. So first, let's look at enable or disable the order checking system, and it's just an option that edits the parameter, just like with notifications. And we see that at this particular site, it is enabled. So we can go out of that. And then let's look under parameters for order check and see what we have there. And under parameters, we have all sorts of things that are somewhat similar to notifications. So that's good and bad. You'll see a lot of terminology that is the same as notifications. Sometimes we can get a little confused between, are we working with notifications or are we working with order check? Just with time, you'll get used to using them. Let's see, there is enable, disable, and order check. That would probably be the best place to start. We could look at the package level and see what order checks are available to be turned on or enabled. And there's a few less than notifications, right? That's good. But each of these items, allergy, contrast media, allergy, drug interaction, and so on, they have a set of rules behind them that cause them to be triggered when certain things happen in the system, so Boolean logic type things. And one of the nice things about the design block that we give out to the clients whenever we're training with clinical configuration is that it does have a list of the current order checks and a designation or explanation of what that order check is and what it should do. Mm-hmm. The other place that you can find that explanation is in FileMan. So if you're working in this and you're not sure exactly what an order check means, that's a couple of places that you can use to actually find the definition or explanation of what that order check does.
Yeah, I think I saw that when I was going through the block. I looked at it.
Great. Okay. So one of the most important, I think, to be turned on are the two the allergy drug interaction and the allergy contrast media. So let's look at allergy drug and see if it's turned on at this site. And I'm not explaining every step I'm taking because this is so similar to notifications. You've seen this already to some extent. So the order check is allergy-drug interaction, and if I press enter, then I have a valued value field to fill in. If I double question mark, it does give an explanation here too that talks about what happens if you enable this order check. So a flag indicating if an order check should be processed for a certain set of circumstances. An order check can be enabled or disabled. Only enabled order checks will be processed. So very similar to notification. Mm-hmm. So this one is enabled, and that's a good thing. Every site enables that. So I would press enter, and then I come to the next order check. So I can continue to go through all of the order checks and to enable or disable them as appropriate for that site. So I can press enter again, and it'll bring me back to my menu. Now, one of the things we already mentioned that the terminology is a little bit different about setting this to mandatory. The other thing that's different is that the setting it to mandatory cannot be accomplished from the same option like it can in notifications. In the order checking system, you have to go back and use EDT, mark order check editable by user. So little different terminology plus an extra option. So let's look at that for the order check that we just set. And notice there are only 2 levels that you can set these at. And this is probably another thing that we need to look at with customer care, like notifications, to see if there's a benefit to setting at the division or at the system level.
Right, I remember that.
I see that package is missing here, which is odd. There may not be a package setting, or perhaps that package setting is never presented to us, because I do have FileMan access, so it's a little strange that package isn't showing up here. But we could choose number 2 for system for today and look at the one that we just set, allergy drug interaction. And again, it's going to ask, are you adding? And of course, that's not to add the order check. It's just asking, are you adding a setting for the order check?
Right.
Say yes. And then it presents us with the order check that we have in play. And then it says editable by user, and I'm going to question that so you can see what it has to say about that. So the answer would be yes or no, right? And access to change the order check is turned off if you set it to no. So they cannot enable or disable. Okay, so we're going to say no, not editable. And then we could continue to go through all the order checks.
Okay.
I'm going to enter, and then we're going to go back to GUI and see if we can get that to show up without signing back in. I think we can. Yes. So now allergy drug interaction is mandatory and on.
Okay.
Which is a good thing. We want to know that, right?
Yep.
Okay. So that's the basics of just how to get one turned on and how to get it set where it's not editable by the user. So then you have some other things that come into play with specific notifications. For example, if we look at I believe it's creatinine. Estimated creatinine clearance. We can first check to see if it's turned on, and it is. And then when we go back through our steps to make sure it's uneditable, right? So we have that one all set up. But then you have to remember, or you have to think about what items the system is checking or mapped to check to determine whether or not the creatinine clearance has been performed and whether or not it's high or low, right? So the place that you would do that is under Edit Local Terms. So if I choose LCL, I then get a list. Now the somewhat confusing part about this list is that you get this little short list, and then you have this statement that says, enter 2 question marks to see the rest of the terms. So I make a habit of 2 question marks just to make sure I'm seeing all the items. So why that list is not displayed in its entirety to begin with, I'm not sure, because as you can see, it's not that long. I think they probably assumed that these are the most commonly used. So in this case, we'd be looking for serum creatinine. And then when we get to that particular item, it asks us to list any laboratory tests that might give us that creatinine clearance. So you are mapping or linking terms, and in this case, terms is representing a lab test, that would be included in the Boolean logic of that rule to decide if this creatinine test has been done, right? Now, one of the problems we run into is that frequently at locations, either there'll be multiple types of tests that could be mapped here, or they'll be named in different ways. So it's a little bit, you must really work with the site's laboratory team to make sure you're picking up the exact lab test that they want at their facility to determine whether or not this clearance has been done.
And you can, at the end, use more than one?
Yes.
Okay,
like in this
and
case,
those top two right where you're at, that BUN and creatinine, are those coming from, being pulled from the site, or is that from the system to start?
from when the first time you look at this, it would be from the system. It would be what Ready to Go has set up.
Okay.
But this particular one I know I've already edited, so these are actually the tests at this site.
Okay. All right.
And so, you know, one of them is BUN, creatinine. So it could have been listed the other way, right? Creatinine/BUN. So you really have to work with them to find out what they are going to call their test that gives you this answer.
Information. Okay. Yeah, I
And
understand
yes, it can be more than one.
kind of concept. Okay.
Okay. So another thing to notice is that there's several of these things. So dangerous meds for patients over 64. If you look at that, it lets you list the medications that you feel are, your facility feels are dangerous to meds at 64. And usually this is based on a standard, right?
Right, right.
So, and this one I have not edited for this site, so whether or not they have these items and that they are the total list is unknown at this point, so this one could be edited later.
Okay.
Okay, and you add these the same way. You just type in the name of the medication, search through the list, and select it.
And you have to, when you're right there, like to select orderable items, or you go one at a time and then just go back and keep adding, or you can do multiple.
One at a time and keep adding.
One at a time, okay.
Right. So for each one of these, your answers might be a little bit different, but that's how you would map them. Metformin drugs. Okay. So questions so far about how to enable, how to mark them uneditable, and then how to map a site local term.
Not so far, and that's kind of the order you go in, as far as when you're initially setting things up.
I do, yes. I think the enable and the set to not editable is probably always the first two things you would do. And then after that, it's kind of up to you as to, you know, which other items you want to look at. As you can see, there's a whole list of things
Yeah.
need to be looked at. So we'll just start at the top and start going through those. Creatinine date range for contrast media orders. This is similar to what we were just looking at, but in this case, it's telling them how many days to look backwards. And that is generally 30 days. I haven't seen that much different. I think one place might have set theirs to 40.
Okay.
And then the next one is CT scanner height limit and weight limit are the next two. And you can set those at the system or division level because, you know, that some places at the VA had more than one scanner at different divisions. And then, excuse me, this is just a number, a weight value. I'm sorry, height value. And then same thing, very, very similar. Okay. And then you have, and I don't think this particular site has a CT scanner, if I remember right. But if they do, we'll need to find out what their limits are.
Okay.
And this is a site-by-site site that we're currently working on, I have just been asking questions and finding answers sort of not randomly, but to different individuals because I know this site operates a little bit differently.
Uh-huh.
But another site, most other sites, I actually would sit down, have a meeting, and we would have the clinical team, the pharmacist, the radiology department, and the lab department representatives all in the same room.
Uh-huh.
And a physician representative, and we would discuss every order check and all of these settings and make those changes as we were talking. I found that's easier to do.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're back and forth and all over the place and trying to organize information. I knew that wouldn't happen in exactly that way at this site, so I've done it a little bit different there. But just for your future reference whenever you're working on these, it's a good idea to have all those players in the room while you're doing it.
And just go through it. Mm-hmm.
Just go through it. That's exactly right. Danger level is where you determine whether the danger level is going to be high, moderate, or low. And those settings determine whether or not the person has to just click continue to override it, or if they have to actually type in text for a reason that they're overriding. So allergy drug interaction in this case is set to high. So if they order penicillin when the patient is allergic to penicillin, they would have to type in their reason why. The text is free text, so there's no like set of code or items that to choose from, but they do have to type in a reason, and that is stored in the order, as we previously said. So for each order check that you enable, you also need to set their danger level. Enable, disable, debug message logging. Sometimes that's a good idea to turn it on in the beginning. However, this system has already been, pretty much tried and true, so there's not a lot of value left to turning on the debug message. In the early days, it was very valuable.
Okay.
Okay, and then you have lab duplicate order range, and what this does is it allows you to set the value or the number of hours, and this is in hours, backwards in time to look for duplicate lab orders.
Uh-huh.
And in my mind, 48 hours is a little bit long because, you order a CBC every day on most patients.
Yeah, exactly.
So generally speaking, we would normally change this to about 24 hours.
Okay.
And that would cut down a little bit on, just overwhelming order checks.
Uh-huh. And what I was looking for, and I guess have figured out that it is just set by lab orders in general. You can't set it to say, CBC, might be 24 hours or something less, whereas something else could be longer, but it's just set by lab orders, period.
Right, and the only thing that probably could help you out with that is the location setting.
Uh-huh.
So that if you notice that in the MICU, sometimes they'll do CBCs every 8 hours or whatever.
Uh-huh.
Where on the unit, it's a lot less likely to happen that frequently.
Right.
And you could put a different setting on MICU versus every other location.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that'll help you a little bit with that, but no, it is across the board for every lab in that area. Okay. And then you have duplicate orderable item, and this can be a little bit. This is specific for certain orderable items. So when you question mark, you get every single orderable item in the system. So if you had a problem, if you had a facility that ordering, multiple AccuChecks, like way overboard too many times. You could set a duplicate order check on that orderable item so that they would see that that's already been ordered in the past 8 hours or however long.
So that's where you could actually set a specific order.
Yes, and notice all the medications, some of the medications are in here, the admit to, and all sorts of things. And
just everything, honestly, that they could order.
Yes. And
okay, so that's how you could actually key in if you had to. Okay.
I thought it was going to give me some information, but for you to see. But yes, and so that would be specific to orderable items. We generally do not set that one, unless, of course, it's something really specific. Because, like, for example, when you create a nursing order using the quick order option that MedSphere created, then every one of those nursing orders has the orderable item of nursing attached to it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Every time the doctor ordered more than one nursing order for that patient, they would get that order check. So, we pretty much don't have to use that one very often. Okay, radiology duplicate order range, exactly the same thing, so no need to go through that. We already talked about marking orders uneditable or editable. We've enabled or disabled. There's a creatinine date range for glucophage, and you can set that as a package system or location. And so this one is all based. And this has to do with the glucophage order. And then we talked about editing local terms. And then you have an MRI scanner and height and weight, and it's exactly very similar to the CT scanner, height and weight. And then you have polypharmacy. They love this one. So polypharmacy, and in this case it's set to 7, which in my mind is way too low. But it probably depends on the facility and what types of care they have. And it again can be set different by location. So if you wanted to say that overall at the package level or system level, polypharmacy was 11 or 12, but you wanted to change that for a geriatric unit, for example, or possibly an ICU, you could do that at the location level. So this is the one that pops up and says your patient is at risk for polypharmacy based on the number you have entered here. So this would mean 7 meds or more. So it looks for active meds. Okay, and then you have this order checks that user can receive, and this is similar to notifications in that it's a great troubleshooting tool so that you can see which order checks are turned on and at what level, who turned it on. Generic results, no value found. Radiology mode of transport, no value found. Okay, so this was order check parameters, so we're going to press enter and go back one level. And this is where you're going to find more of the configuration options. So let's talk about a couple of these that we haven't looked at yet. One of them is activate or inactivate rules. Now, Ready to Go already has rules activated that would be any rule possibly that might be used at a site. So generally speaking, we do not have to go and activate or inactivate a rule. at it just so you see how it looks. So you're pulling up your allergy-contrast media. The status is active. If we wanted it inactive, we would change that status here.
Okay.
And that's all there is to that.
Okay.
Compile the rules. I have used that pretty frequently. And what it does is once you've turned things on, or especially if you have just mapped some local terms, it's a really good idea to go back and run the rule compiler. So you select that option that says, do you want to queue the compiler to run? And you can say yes. And then it goes by your screen really fast, but what it tells you is that the compiler is queued to run in 10 seconds, and you'll be sent a mailman bulletin when it's finished.
Okay.
And what that does, of course, it just goes back and makes all those connections work, because it's like a refresh.
Okay.
Okay? And then inquire to the expert system will let you display a rule so that you can have way more information about whether or not, or how that rule is supposed to run.
Wow.
Yeah, so this has all sorts of data, and if you are a mumpster or know how to read mumps code, then you definitely would know way more, right?
Yep, that could be true.
I wanted it to give me the second one, allergy. No. Okay. So that just gives you more information about each rule if you wanted
Just the detail.
If you wanted it in that detail, yes. Which I seldom do because I can't read that as well anyway, so. Okay, questions about order checks and how you turn them on, editing site level terms, anything we've covered so far?
I don't think. It seemed pretty straightforward when I was going through, the manual parts of it and stuff. It seemed like it was as straightforward as most anything.
It is very straightforward. There are some things that have been updated, like sometimes you'll run into issues with certain rules not acting like they should.
Okay.
And in that case, like the glucophage one is one of those famous ones. Almost everywhere we go, there's some kind of build that's missing in the background that's supposed to make that one work. So frequently we'll have to put in an artifact to get somebody to look to see, what's missing or whatever. Another good thing is to go through the SourceForge items and see if you see one already entered for that.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes it will tell you what the update or fix was for that particular item, and then you'll be able to ask the right person to give you the build to make that work.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. But we go through all our configurations first, make sure we have that correct, and then we check to see if there's something missing, if it's not working. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I think is difficult about order checks is sometimes it's difficult to test them because you have to have so many things in place to make them trigger.
Sure, yeah.
In certain cases, so it's a little bit harder to test them sometimes.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay, so we'll move right on. The next thing we're going to talk about is delayed events and auto discontinue rules.
Now that seemed a little more confusing to me.
Right, it is. Now, the premise, and I think you are already pretty clear on this part, but I'll just cover it really briefly so we process of a patient being moved from, for example, an emergency room status to an inpatient status. And the doctor would normally just pull off another order sheet or find another blank order sheet in the chart, write their new orders for the new location on it, fold it over, give it to the nurse, and the staff would know to act on those orders after they get to the inpatient unit.
Right.
So electronically, this is CareView's or CPRS, this is this system's way of duplicating that process. So along those lines, you have a couple of different types of delayed orders, for example. So we're going to talk about this in two sections. One, delayed orders, and the other is auto discontinue of previous orders. So they go hand in hand, but we'll talk about them separately. Then within delayed orders, you have two different types of delayed orders. One type is a delayed order that is triggered by an ADT event, admit, discharge, or transfer event, in the system that the client is using that then sends a message to CareView, and CareView picks up the admission, and that's what triggers or admit, discharge, transfer, and that is the event that would trigger an automatic release of this type of delayed orders. So automatically released delayed orders. You have a second type of delayed orders, and those are manually released delayed orders. So they are created with the type manual, and they are expected to always be manually released by a user in the system on the fly. Generally, we use those type of orders for events that would not have an ADT event to trigger them. So, post-op orders would be a good example because the patient does not always move from one location to another whenever they go to the operating room and then back to the unit.
Right.
We do have several sites that have created a virtual unit like OR, PACU, post-op, and they actually do rely on an ADT movement and allow that to trigger those manual release orders. Some of that was done before manual release orders were working as they were intended. KMC is a good example of that. Beauregard uses a similar setup, I believe. So with every client site, you may see something slightly different. Since we have manual release orders working now, we've tried to steer them more towards that because manual release orders does not then depend on a clerical person to change the patient location. Yeah. Okay. It does, however, depend on nursing staff usually to release the order. So you kind of have six in one hand, half a dozen in the other, but it seems to work better with the nursing staff with the onus being on the nursing staff in this case.
Yeah, because they're the one that wants the orders. They're waiting for stuff to happen.
Right, exactly, and they're held up if things get synced. Okay, so then the other reasons you might use a manual release delayed order is for orders that don't necessarily have an admission involved, but maybe you have the patient coming back for a lab or diagnostics in 2 weeks after being admitted, or maybe they were in the clinic, right? And you want those orders for the lab and diagnostics to be attached or linked to that future appointment rather than today's appointment. So you would write those orders as a manual release type order, and then when the patient comes back, either the clerk or the tech, whoever's involved in those diagnostics, depending on the client and their process, one of those individuals would release those orders manually and release them to the appropriate visit number. Okay. Now, it's difficult to demonstrate this all the way through in CareView lab, rad, post-op, and pre-op, all three of which are manual type release orders.
Right.
And then you have admit to bridges and admit to med surg. Now, when you are working with a larger hospital that has more things going on, for example, KMC, they have an entire list of possible events you could delay orders to.
Okay.
This one's pretty cut and dried, so that's nice. They don't even use transfer. They discharge from the hospital and readmit whenever they move from ER to inpatient.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't even have your transfer rules on here, or events on here.
But you would, in typical other hospitals at least, you would see transfers.
Yes, this is the only client I've seen so far that did not use transfers.
Okay.
So I would click on any item to delay the order. So let's say we did a post-op orders. We would select that as the provider, click OK, and it's going to tell us that we're delaying those orders. So then we could use any order set we wanted. Now, some other things that will come into play when we're looking at setting these up is that you can also mark them to be able to copy previous orders, so that it displays automatically orders that the patient was on in the previous location. So the doctor can just highlight the ones they want and copy them to the new location.
I remember that, yep.
You can set a specific admit dialogue, which would not necessarily come into play for manual release orders, but for ADT ones, it would, right? And so you could set your specific dialogue for admission, and then that would prompt the doctor to fill in the information needed, right? So in this case, let's just put a couple in so that and it does tell us or warn us that it's writing these for delay.
And you did say once you've determined or marked it that this is going to be a delayed order, you still have access to all orders.
Yes, you have access to all menus, anything you want to write.
Okay.
And their delayed orders would be longer, but I'm just doing a couple for the sake of time. When they're in a delayed status, and the physician or nurse would sign or release without MD signature. There's our order check. Patient has no allergy.
Mm-hmm.
And they would place those orders in a delayed or suspended status. Now, since these are manual release orders, they will never release or come into play until someone manually releases them.
Right.
With a set of admission orders, of course, they would come into play with that ADT movement. Now, that is nice, but it also brings in a whole, another can of worms. And that has to do with the timing of those movements.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in this case, let's say that the nurse got this patient after surgery, right? And they are in the correct location. They check that first. And then they would highlight the orders and release them. And that would put those orders into active play. Now, the way that we teach this, especially for manual release orders, is that if you have a patient who's going to the operating room and they're going to come out on the other side and they already have post-op orders written in a delayed status, you would want, of course, to discontinue manually the previous orders and then release your delayed orders. So it's a little less confusing that way.
I understand discontinuing the previous orders so they don't get jumbled up with the new active ones.
Right.
And there's not, is that where some of that auto DC stuff comes into play?
It does not, because your auto DC is also based on an ADT movement.
Oh, okay.
If you're using manual release orders, most of the time you're also going to manually discontinue previous.
Okay, just a teaching point that you want to get them to go through the currently active orders before they release new ones.
Right. So now that we know how these work in GUI in the foreground, let's look at how we set them up in the background to make them work that way. So we would also go to ORD for this, I believe. Yes. And we are looking for delayed orders configuration. And under that, we have delayed orders auto DC setup. So see how they're kind of together, but you're going to have two options. And then there's also on this one an enable event delayed orders overall parameter. So this says we're even going to allow them to use them at all, right, in the system.
Okay.
And then you can inspect the patient's chart. If something goes wrong, there's some tools that will help you look to see what orders were actually released and why. And then there's some other parameters we're going to look at. And then release cancel delayed orders was an option that was used primarily when even the physicians and nursing were using the roll and scroll putty, character-based. So, but what we really want to see is delayed orders auto DC setup. So we're looking at release event. So we're going to look at that first. And these events come from ready to go with a couple of standard ones set up, an admission, a transfer, and a discharge. And then from there, you can add specific ones for that site. Now, you recognize this template because you've seen this with orders and note titles and all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, we're in event setup and maintenance. And then we have each event listed. And then we also have the greater than arrow, which means there's more information, right?
Yep.
Oops, or maybe not. No, there is. Nope, there's not. So we have the event itself, we have the display text, we have whether or not it's active, and then we have the type of event. So this is where we would decide, is it an admission, is it a discharge, is it a manual event, or a transfer?
Uh-huh.
The only option that you've probably seen in the manual that you would not, at this point, ever see with a MedSphere setup is an operating room one. And it's because we don't use the surgery package quite yet. So,
okay.
But let's work with what we do have right now. So, admit to bridges is a previously set up one, and that one I believe is one that I edited from ready to go. So let's take a look at it. Now across the bottom you have all of your options that you can use to look at these items. So first of all, let's just look at DD, which is a detailed display of number 1. So we're going to type DD and we're going to choose number 1. And it's going to give us all the details about that order. I'm sorry, that delayed order event. So it has a name, and you could give it a short name if you wanted to. What the short name does is change the way it's displayed here.
Oh, okay.
When you're on the delayed orders event. And then you have inactivated, yes or no, right? Active or inactive. And then you have the type of event, which in this case is admission. You have admit to division, and the division in this case is Memorial Hospital Stillwell. And I will tell you that with delayed orders and auto discontinue rules, this admit to division has been a problem. For some reason, it sometimes comes with a setting of 1, which is General Hospital. And that's a hospital that's set up and ready to go as sort of a preliminary or space holder, right?
Uh-huh.
So one of the things that you will do as the clinical consultant is when you build these rules or change them or make them up new, you will always check to make sure the for some of the upgrades, copy over certain things in your setup. This is one of the things that we suspect is getting copied over. So every time there's an upgrade, I usually go back into that site and check all of my rules and all of my delayed order events and make sure this is still correct for that facility. Okay, then remember how we talked about you could put in a specific order, admit order dialog? This is the field where you would do that. And then if you know that that event is always going to utilize a specific order set or menu, you could also enter that. So if it's a post-op order that's specifically for say, post-total knee arthroscopy or something. You have an order set specific to that, then you could enter that order set and it would automatically be displayed to the provider when they select that event.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's nice. And then you have lapse in number of days. So this means that if this delayed order is not, and this one's based on an admission, so if the admission to the location that this order is, this event is specific for, in this case, bridges, if that event does not happen between the time that this order was delayed and 30 days later, it will automatically lapse and it will not be eligible for release.
Okay. And there's no notice necessarily. It's just that when they go to do something, they'll see that there's no orders there anymore.
That's right. And
okay.
So generally speaking, you want this to be as long as these orders would ever be good for. So that sounds not right, but it means that, like for a pre-op order, sometimes you might write your pre-op orders at the point of a clinic admission, right?
Right.
So the patient's over in the clinic and doctor's writing, they're doing their pre-op assessment or eval, and they write their pre-op orders then. Well, those labs and orders are generally only good for 14 to 30 days, depending on your facility.
Right.
So you could set a limit of 30 days if that's how long those labs are good for. If that's how long those orders are good for.
Yep.
Okay. So generally speaking, it's about 30 days. Sometimes it's longer, depending on the situation.
Okay.
The MAS movement type is only used at the VA, so we never answer that question. It's always left. And then your display text is just what the doctor sees here. When they click on delayed orders, this is the display text.
Okay.
And then the ordering parameters location in this case is bridges. And we'll see an explanation of what that means in a minute, but basically it means whenever you release these orders, what locations, print parameters, etc., do you want this rule to use? And then this one has set up so that you can copy active orders if you wanted to. And it's just a yes-no field. And then you have included location. And included location is what tells this event that if the patient hits that location electronically, these orders need to be released. Now, you can have more than one location in a single event. You cannot use the same location in multiple events.
Say it again.
You can have more than one location in a single event. You cannot use the same location in multiple events.
Okay.
So an example of that would be they have the virtual beds, and they also have several units that do not require a change in level of care. So they can transfer back and forth between those units, and the doctor never has to write new orders.
Right.
Right? So we wrote the rules so that those three, the virtual unit, the regular unit, and any other unit that is at the same level of care, if the physician writes that event, the patient can hit any one of those locations, and these rules will release.
Okay.
Okay, so from this screen, you even have the ability to add or edit from this location. You also have this really nice feature, which is the ability to add or show the history of all of the changes made to this rule or event. Now, one caveat to that is that even if a person goes in and just looks at it, you know, as if they were editing but they didn't change anything, they have to go into the edit part, but let's say they go through it but they don't change anything, it still shows in the history that that person was in that event.
Okay.
The reason I think that's really nice is because, especially with sites that edit their own events, it can cause some pretty big issues if they mess one up accidentally. So it's good to be able to know that Julie was in there last, so ask Julie what she did.
Yeah.
If you can't see real easily what she did. Okay, so I want to add edit just so you can see we know what the answers to these fields are supposed to be, but let's see what they look like. Oh, we need to do one thing. Sorry. I'm going to inactivate this really quick. Hopefully they're not using it at the moment. We are in their dev, so it's okay. So it's giving me a warning that this event has some delayed orders associated with it already, and editing it may affect those delayed events. And then from there, it shows you the name that you already have created, the display text that's already there, and then the type of event, and then the division. And remember, that's the one that you're just checking to make sure it really does match the client. MAS movement is always left blank. Included treating specialties. So far with MedSphere, and customer care may have a different experience, but I have not seen this work appropriately. It does work at the VA because they do have treating specialties that are linked or tied to every single one of their admission locations. I've not seen that work very well at MedSphere yet. But it's basically another way you could trigger these rules. You could say every time they hit Med-Surg treating specialty, these rules can release.
I see.
So far, we've left that blank, though.
Okay.
And then here's your included locations. And you would just list them one after another if there's more than one.
Okay.
And then there's your short name, and it's usually 3 to 4 characters if you want a short name. Here's the order dialog that we already created, right? You have to have this already built in your orders area. It can be a generic order, it can be a quick order, either one. In most cases, it's a generic order. And you just enter the name of your order dialog that you want to use here.
Okay. That's going to be the trigger.
That's going to be, it's not the trigger, so it's not necessarily, it doesn't have anything to do with when the orders are released, but it does need to match what type of orders the doctor would be writing here.
Okay.
Remember, the trigger is the location.
Right, the move. It's shelf.
Right, exactly. Okay, and then you have the option to put in an order set or menu, either one if you wanted.
Okay. What happens, Julie, if that order dialogue doesn't match?
The only thing it would do is confuse the provider.
Okay.
It doesn't it doesn't have any Boolean logic or anything that triggers or doesn't trigger, but it would look odd to the provider. Like if I had accidentally put in ORGX move admit to med surge there, then the provider might look at that and go, what is that? That's all it does.
Okay.
It just needs to match what they're doing.
Okay.
Now, you do, for an event that is based on an automatic ADT event, you do need to have your order dialogue in there. Not so much to trigger anything, but because that's the order that is, when the doctor signs it, it is listed both on the delayed orders and on the active orders. And that's so that the staff in the ER gets an active order that says admit to nursing station.
Yeah.
And then that order is also listed in the delayed orders so that the staff receiving the patient has the admit to nursing station order.
Right.
So as far as, code or logic behind that, that's the only thing that is tied to, is making it display in both places. And then you have a lapse number of days, and we talked about that, and it's just a number for representing the days. And then our ordering parameters location. This field is used to retrieve the parameter values when delaying orders to this event. So it has to do with printing values and things, printing parameters and things like that. Copy active orders. We talked about that already also. It has to do with whether or not the active current orders are going to be presented for copying to the future event. And then you have one last option, and this is the ability to select at any of these levels, user, location, service, division, system, for this event, is there a specific right orders list you want invoked? Now, at really large hospitals like the VA that I worked at, we used this because, first of all, we had, more than one division. We had 3 divisions, and then we also had numerous right orders lists that we used. So we had a specific right orders list for nurses, a specific one for geriatric physicians, a specific one for orthopedic physicians, and so on. So this was useful at that type of facility. Most of the time, we don't really get that deep into different right orders lists for the hospitals we work with.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, there's one right orders list. Everybody uses the same one, so there's no need to invoke a specific one per event.
Mm-hmm. Let me just make sure I'm following this. An example may be like you have maybe different types of orders for like a skilled care unit. So you might...
Right, and it would be beyond just picking one order menu. Like, you already had the option where you could say, okay, this order is always for bridges, so I'm going to put the orders menu for bridges, or in this case, psychiatry, behavioral health. I'm going to put that in that field and have it bring up that menu. This is beyond that. This is
like
there's
almost
right orders list.
The whole thing is specific to them.
For bridges, so I'm going to invoke that right orders list.
Okay. So yeah, you wouldn't do that very often for regular.
No, not really. We did a lot, but it was because we functioned differently than most of our facilities. here. Okay, so I want to reactivate this, right? Because they may want to use it. Okay, and then I'm going to show the history. So see, it has my name every time I've been through the edit process of this rule, this event, including today.
Yep.
Okay. So now we want to hit enter one more time, and then we're back to the beginning of our rules. Now, with every event rule, with the exception of discharge, you have the ability to put in specific locations, etc. Another exception is a manual type event. And the reason for that is because the manual event is not expecting necessarily a specific location to trigger the release.
Right.
So you wouldn't specify in that case. Now, you can write specific admit rules for every location. You can have one for bridges, one for nursing station, one for same-day surgery, one for OB, one for, and I'm using the examples from this hospital, but it's limitless as far as all of the types of events you want to release. Okay, now the one thing that we are not going to cover is creating child events, and that's for a similar reason as the right orders issue. Our facilities, for the most part, would not use a child event. It's just as easy just to write all of the rules as parents.
Okay.
But a child event would be an event that operates exactly the same way as another rule. Okay. And then you have activate, inactivate, which we've discussed already. And then change display. And you can look at all entries, just active ones or just inactive. So we want all entries. I don't know why it's not showing that second page. We might all look into that. But that's an expanded view, and as you can see on these, there are no children views. There are no children events created, so you don't see anymore. Okay. Questions about release events? I know that's a lot. That actually is a lot of information, but that should be at least a beginning to how you could set these up. The nice thing about delayed events, Diane, is that there's some pretty good information in the manuals about.
Yeah, it was like I said. I went through manuals and things, and it's really pretty specific. I mean, so yeah, it's just. I think now it's just getting back into the system and seeing it again to make sure it's all tied together.
Okay, so we're going to keep moving. We're going to talk now. I'm going to press enter one more time, and we're going to talk about auto DC rules, which is the other thing that goes hand in hand with an automatic type release event. So if I want to use an ADT event for a release event, I do not necessarily have to have auto DC rules written for it. They can operate independently.
Say that, Julie. Say that one more time. I'm listening.
No, I know that. I understand. You do not necessarily have to have an auto. I said they work hand in hand, right? You do not necessarily have to have an auto DC rule that matches every ADT release event.
Okay.
It's probably optimal that you do, because you're working off of something. You're trying to make it easier for the providers to see rules, to see orders that match the location they are working in. So yes, they work together. It is most beneficial if there is an auto DC rule for every release event. Now, having said that, they don't necessarily marry up exactly. For example, an admission auto DC rule is across the board for any admission anywhere. You don't get to put in locations.
Okay.
Ward transfer, on the other hand, can be location specific.
Okay.
So every time that if we take the scenario of emergency department, admission, and then transitioning to an admission, then you can see that there is an auto DC rule that would apply, no matter what release event they choose. And that's the admission one.
Right.
Okay. So if you think about it in nursing process rather than setup, it'll help you, I think, to see how they work together. So if I am a nurse in nursing station and I get a patient with automatically released orders that the doctor wrote ahead of time for my unit in nursing station, and the admission auto DC rule is not turned on, then I'm going to have a jumbled mess of orders.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have both of those working hand in hand, then you have a cleaner set of orders when the nursing station.
Okay. That makes a little more sense, like you said.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. All right. So now that we know how those are supposed to work together, now let's look at how you would actually set one up. So we'll start with admission, because admission, death, and discharge are all across the board for any admission to the hospital, any death, or any discharge. So let's look at admission first. And your options at the bottom are pretty close to those for a release event. And we're going to use DD, detailed display, and choose admission. And then you get to see all of the fields possible in this rule. Now remember, every single auto DC rule is triggered by an ADT event.
Okay.
Okay. So you have a name, admission, whether it's inactivated or not, and then the type of event, in this case, is admission. Again, this admit to division, check it every time. Every time there's an upgrade, every time there's a new go live, always check. And we talked about the reason already, so we'll go into that. Then your DC reason is the text that will show up in the order here. Right under this section, there'll be it'll say discontinued, and then out to the side it'll say due to movement admit.
Okay.
Something like that. That may not be verbatim, but very close. So this is the text that shows up as the reason the order was discontinued. And then your display text, of course, is what shows up again. Well, actually, I'm not sure where that shows up. Anyway, let me think about that for a minute. Because it would show up for a delayed event, but I'm not sure where it would show up for auto DC, because auto DC rules are basically in the background. The only time you see them is when something auto DCs and you have that reason for the auto DC.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So then the movement types are all of the possibilities, all the possible type of movements that could get sent across in an HL7 message from the client's ADT system. Now, in the case of the system we're looking at now, they're actually using our DG VA ADT system rather than a foreign system that's integrated.
Right.
So your movement type, you could figure out every type of HL7 message that's going to come across, or you could just put them all in.
Because if they're not using them, it won't come across.
Right. So I just put them all in.
Okay.
And in this case, that's a good thing because we're actually using our own system. Now, most of the time, it's going to be a direct admit. But I add all of them just to cover all my bases.
Okay.
Okay. And then I'm going to scroll down so you can see the only, one of the fields that's different from your admission or your release event is the packages that would be included in the auto DC. So you get to dictate which types of orders are discontinued. So if you wanted to discontinue everything but lab, then you'd leave lab out of this list.
And that's what they do there, like at MHS, right?
Yes, and there's, customer care probably has a lot of input there that we probably need, but there are some significant problems that we've run into, especially with labs, with them auto discontinuing, and it's based on, I think there's a setting in the lab package, and then our settings in the auto DC rules, and whether or not labs that are active get DC'd. The labs that are active are not supposed to DC. So active means they've already been accessioned, right?
Uh-huh.
But even so, some facilities want their labs to never auto DC, even if they're still in a pending state, and so on. And I think their thinking behind that is that if you have a lab in place, so the doctor orders a CBC and then they decide to admit them, there's no reason the doctor necessarily should have to rewrite that CBC.
Right.
Now, you could also look at it from the more black and white perspective of every order has to be rewritten. So it kind of depends on their bylaws and how they interpret them.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you have the case of patients maybe that are entered as a death, and perhaps they need results to a certain lab to know cause of death or whether or not they're contagious, things like that. People have gotten stuck before and they put in, the screening or whatever they do for the patient, and then the lab got discontinued. So there's,
and they report back on it then.
Right. So there's a lot of things that come into play when you're trying to plan for. So sometimes it's better, or I see it as being better, to recommend that they not auto DC. And then if down the road they're really having problems with those not getting carried out, because there is that issue. They order it and then they discharge the patient, you leave it active, the lab never gets drawn,
Yeah.
so they stay pending on the chart forever. So you have that side of things too.
Which happens manually already without a system, so.
Right. That's true. So generally speaking, some of the things that I recommend they do not auto DC are lab, radiology, and consult. Because generally, unless it's a death, they probably want the consult to be carried out, even if they get discharged.
Yeah.
So those are some of the items. So let's walk through. I'm going to inactivate this one, and then we'll walk through the setup of it. So we're going to choose AE for add or edit. And then we get to see the name. And then the display text, which I still am not sure where that shows up. And then the type of event is admission in this case. These are the types we could choose, with the exception of OR again, because we're not using that package yet. And specialty transfer, same issue you have with specialties in the release events. They're not really always all mapped correctly. So I do not use specialty.
Okay.
And then we're making sure the division is correct for that facility. And then the type of movement, these you enter one at a time, and then it creates a list. So these are the currently this is what's currently in there as far as movement types. So that's anytime you get an admission of that type, you're going to auto DC orders. And this is our text that shows up as our reason for discontinuing in the order itself. And then this is where we get to select the types of orders we want to discontinue. So the list at the top is what is already in our rule.
Mm-hmm.
The list at the bottom includes those at the top and others. So you can see that in this one we've left out lab, we've left out radiology, and we've left out consults.
So the bottom is really all your options.
Yes, yes. Now, one of the questions we get frequently is, what exactly does OR, order entry results reporting, what does that involve? And that is every order that is a nursing, vitals, activity, ADT, all of those orders that do not have a package. Like, they don't go to the pharmacy, they don't go to the lab, they don't go, right? All of those orders are combined there. So if I say order entry results reporting, I'm picking up all the nursing, all the vitals, all the activity, all the MAS orders.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the next couple of prompts will allow you to make exceptions. So you can say, based on display group, and the display group means this group. So I could say, I want all of the order entry result reporting to auto DC except those that are showing up in the nursing display group, or except those that are showing up in vitals.
Oh.
So it gives you some ways to kind of drill down even a little further.
And that's just specific to the order entry results reporting one?
No, any display group.
Any display group.
That was just our example. So any display group. So you could say all inpatient orders except clinic orders. All labs, there's only one display group, so it doesn't help you there. All inpatient medications except IV.
Okay.
Okay. And then you can go even more specific and do all orders except for this specific orderable item. So if you had an order that was for the PIC team to come and place the PIC line, and you never want that to auto DC, never ever, then you could put it here in every rule, and it would never auto DC because of its orderable item. If you never want a CBC to auto DC specifically, you could put it there.
Okay. So that's your final kind of last option for saving something.
Right. For saving it. That's exactly right. Not going to get the axe if you put it there. Okay, so that's the final setup with auto DC rules. Now, notice that we can also see the history here too, so that's nice.
Okay.
I'm going to reactivate this one. Yes. And then go back to our list. So that's how an admission looks. The death and the discharge are very, very similar. The only difference is, you can change which types of orders you want to auto DC. And then the type, of course, is different. But that's the only thing that's different from admission. Your from absent, sick, and hospital, and from past, so far we have not used. That was very much a VA thing. Specialty change, again, we have not used. And these are inactive, right? They just come with ready to go.
Okay.
And then to absent, sick in hospital has to do with from absence sick, so we don't use those either. Ward transfer with this facility we're not using, but with other facilities we do, and that's where things get really hairy. So we need to go through that. Unfortunately, we do need to go through that. So let's look at number 10, and we will pretend we're setting one up. So we could write. This is where we would give it a name. We could either select an existing one or give it a name. We're going to select number 10. If I could type it right, and it'll say, okay, now you're editing the auto DC rule, and it'll take immediate effect. Now, the difference between one of the things that's a little bit odd about or different about this is that if you wanted to set up a rule for ward transfer, the auto DC rules would not be listed out at the top of your template separately. They're all under ward transfer. But within that, you can start to break that down to if they're transferred from this particular unit to this particular unit, then we want the rules auto DC. If they're transferred from anywhere or all locations to ICU, we want all orders DC.
Right.
Okay, so let's walk through this. Ward transfer is always the name. Display text is word transfer. The event, again, is transfer. We're checking to make sure that says the correct facility. And then the type is inter-ward transfer. And that's the only type available. So that's easy enough. The DC reason is transfer. You could type out more if you wanted. Transfer, inter-ward transfer, transfer from one unit to another, whatever you want there. And then this is where it starts to let you break down exactly how you want this rule to work. Are you working at a facility that no matter where the patient is transferred to or from, all orders have to be rewritten? If so, you could just use all locations to all locations. Now, as long as I've been doing this, that has never been the case.
Yeah.
So, usually we're breaking down a lot further than that. So, currently that's the only one that is already in the system. Now, generally speaking, this is where we would start changing. We would change with this very first one, and all locations to all locations would not exist. So we would replace, remember how we do that? And we would say, we have that matrix that we give the client.
Yeah,
and they
I
use
remember
that matrix to determine, and I think that was in your paperwork I sent you. And we use that matrix for the client to start mapping out exactly how they want this to happen according to their bylaws. So they might have a rule that says all locations to ICU. And then it starts asking you questions. From all locations, yes. Well, in this case, yes, from all locations. To all locations, yes. Well, no, just to ICU, right?
Right.
So we would say no, and we would enter our location as ICU. Now, unfortunately, this particular site doesn't have an ICU, so we're going to pretend that it's to OB. And then we would have to make our name match. I should have made it OB up here. And then it starts select included locations ID. So now look, this looks like this, included locations ID. So this is your only indication that you're at a new portion of this rule. So now we might say ICU to all locations.
I see. So you're ready to set up another one.
Now it's saying you want a new one. So now we have two. Is it from all locations? No. It's from, we're pretending OB. To all locations? Yes. So that's a basic transfer rule for auto DC. Now, let's say that it's so specific that you have a virtual unit that's an ICU and you have an ICU. So in that case, it blows your whole, plan of being able to write all locations to ICU, because that's no longer true anymore. So then you have to write the rule from every single location except that virtual unit.
Oh, Lordy.
Yeah. Yes.
So virtual beds.
Customer care can tell you, I think we were ready to scream by the time we got KMC set up correctly. And
so
I hope it's still working, because it was the best.
Yeah.
So it's you just kind of have to really be really specific and clear about your bylaws to begin with that you're trying to match, and then, your plan for how you're going to get it to work that way. So we could question mark at this point again, and we'd see our 2 that we have set up.
Okay. And those locations have to be in the system to start with, obviously.
Yeah, they have to be a location already in the system, and the same with, this is the same with release events. You can only have 1 unit per rule. So if I say all locations to ICU, wait, that's not true. You can use ICU more than once in a transfer rule. So you could say 4B to ICU, ICU to 4B, 3B to ICU. So you could use them more than once.
Okay.
Okay.
But you have to watch for, exceptions, especially virtual beds. I could see how that would screw things up.
Right.
Is there still just so I understand the behind-the-scenes stuff, so when you put virtual beds in anywhere, they will show up from a location perspective as that location?
Yes, and the reason that they do that is because generally...
That's where they are, probably. I mean, that's where...
Right, and they call them virtual. In our system, they're real. But they call them virtual because they are not mapped to a billable bed in their ADT system.
Right, yeah.
So you're giving them an electronic housing or electronic...
Be able to do orders and stuff. Yeah, we do that in our ER.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the division would be if you had a multi-divisional place or facility and you wanted this rule to be invoked anytime they hit this one particular division.
Okay.
And that sometimes is true, because I know in the VA we would have a rehab that would be a separate division under our hospital, and they always had to have new orders for rehab.
Yep.
So that's how we would invoke that auto DC rule. And then you get, again, the chance to write or enter which types of rules you want auto DC. Now, the difference here is that you have predefined all these different scenarios, all units to ICU, ICU to all units, but you cannot define separately which orders will auto. You're doing this, you can control when it happens, but you can't control which ones happen as well. It's always the same one. Now you also get your display group you can work with and your orderable item again, so that helps.
Yeah.
But again, it's going to apply to every type of transfer rule you have written.
The types apply. Okay.
So if I have so far I've got two movements, transfer type movements that this is going to take place on.
Uh-huh.
Well, for those two and any others I write, these orders are always going to discontinue unless I accept them here. And even if you accept them, you're accepting them for both of those types of movements.
You still can't make it except for one and not for the other.
Right.
Okay.
That one is inactive, and it's supposed to be inactive because they don't use it there. So I'm going to leave it as such.
Okay.
the two types of manual release, and then you have, well, actually it's more than three, but the one that you would be concerned with usually is and this is usually the technical aspect. So somebody like a Jeremy or David Wiles, or I hope I'm not leaving anybody out, but the technical team would help you with this particular aspect. But all of your rules rely heavily on this aspect, and that is the movement protocols. Now, these protocols are, to my knowledge, you can only see them in FileMan. And I'm not telling you this to say that you need to go look. I'm explaining it so that you know if you're having problems getting your rules to work and you know you haven't set up right, the next thing to check is to ask one of the technical persons to go and look at the movement protocols to make sure they're correct.
Okay.
And we can, everyone at MedSphere can tell you that it has been auto DC rules and manual and auto release events are the most difficult thing to get to work correctly, I think, at every hospital, or from our perspective. At a hospital that is using a foreign ADT system, movement events that you would want to use, or the technical person would use, are CISIA movement events. I have no idea what that stands for. And you can look at them, but it's not a good idea necessarily to change them. So you'd want to get somebody else. But basically, there are probably 1,000 or more. I don't even know how many protocols that could be used. They have come up with, Jeremy and Lloyd Biddle and Lloyd Milligan, they have come up with the ones that they think work and that are working at KMC, all of our previous sites. This particular site uses our own DG or native ADT events, so they would not necessarily be even using or invoking CISIA events. Okay. There's a different one that's used there. But normally there's about 8 or 9 of these that they have set up to work, and they give each one a sequence. And what it does is every time that ADT event occurs and they get that message from the ADT system, it goes through these protocols in this sequence. So this one goes first in this case, and so on. And so the sequence matters, the number here matters, and then which protocol matters. So they have to look at that, and sometimes what they'll do is pull up one that we know is working and work from there.
Backwards kind of.
Right. So you need to know about this. You need to know that you can, ask and get them to look, or I'll help you look, and then we ask them for what we think might be wrong. And it's just a practice. It's an art. You just work at it until you get it to work. So that's involved. There are also parameters in the other packages that can get involved, and I believe, and Roy may be on, he may be able to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that for the most part the packages have turned off their parameters that control auto DC, so that only these rules are having an effect on the orders at the point of transfer, admit, or discharge. I know the pharmacy in particular has parameters, and they've turned theirs off, and I believe lab does too.
Okay. I think I saw a little of that in the notes, yeah.
Right. So there's, all sorts of things that come into play, and then you work with your other team members to optimize the system to function the way you want it to.
Okay.
Okay. Questions so far about what we've covered to this point from Diane, and then we'll open to other people.
No, not again. It's a lot to just try to grasp until you see it in action. And I'm sure when we, or someplace and you start to see trouble with it, it'll start to make more sense the more I use it and see the issues from certain settings and stuff like that. So I think it's a lot of it's just getting the experience with it.
Okay, so I'm going to open questions to the rest of those on the call, and also if there's things you feel like I've missed, would you please bring that up, because I'm subject to that. And then we'll bump print parameters to the next call, because it looks like we're almost at the end of our time. Nothing? Okay, then Diane, we will reconvene next week.
Okay.
And then, anybody on the call, or Diane, if you have questions you have later, then be sure and email me.
Okay, yeah, I'll look through my notes again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you.